Good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and I'm welcoming you here to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020, and tonight I'm reading another chapter from The War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. And it's kind of a black and bleak topic. I urge you to stick through it because it helps us understand really what's in play right now with these vaccines. I don't single anyone out. I just say we've had this ethical conversation before, and they keep coming back and asking us for permission to do what they will with the infirm. So, yeah, it's serious business, but it's something we as citizens have to confront and have to consider the morality and the legality of what we are confronting here tonight. So this chapter 13, maybe appropriately, is called Eugenicide. Murder was always an option. Point 8 of the preliminary report of the Committee of the Eugenics Section of the American Breeders Association to study and to report on the best practical means for cutting off the defective germplasm in the human population. That was all the title of the report. Specified euthanasia as a possibility to be considered. Of course, euthanasia was merely a euphemism, actually a misnomer. Eugenicists did not see euthanasia as a merciful killing of those in pain, but rather a painless killing of people deemed unworthy of life. The method most whispered about and publicly denied, but never out of mind, was a lethal chamber. The lethal chamber first emerged in Britain during the Victorian era as a humane means of killing stray dogs and cats. Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson patented a, quote, lethal chamber for the painless extinction of lower animal life, unquote, in the 1880s. Richardson's original blueprints show a large wood and glass-paneled chamber big enough for a St. Bernard or several smaller dogs, serviced by a tall, slender tank for carbonic acid gas and a heating apparatus. In 1884, the Battersea Dogs Home in London became one of the first institutions to install the device and used it continuously with, quote, perfect success, according to a sales proposal at the time. By the turn of the century, other charitable and animal institutions in England and other European countries were also using the chamber. The solution for unwanted pets was almost immediately contemplated as a solution for unwanted humans, criminals, the feeble-minded, and other misfits. The concept of the lethal chamber was common vernacular by the turn of the century. When mentioned, it needed no explanation. Everyone understood what it meant. In 1895, the British novelist Robert Chambers penned his vision of a horrifying world 25 years into the future. He wrote of a New York where the elevated trains were dismantled and the first government lethal chamber was opened on Washington Square. No explanation of government lethal chamber was offered or necessary. Indeed, the idea of gassing the unwanted became a topic of contemporary chit-chat. In 1901, the British author Arnold White, writing in Efficiency and Empire, isn't that a name, chastised, quote, flippant people of lazy mind who talk lightly of the lethal chamber. In 1905, the British eugenicist and birth control advocate H.G. Wells, our friend, where's this? I got his book right in front of me a second ago. Here it is. I mean, right here, this book right here will tell you all you need to know about their plans for humanity. It's all right here in the book. In 1905, the British eugenicist and birth control advocate H.G. Wells published A Modern Utopia. Quote, "There would be no killing, no lethal chambers," he wrote. Another birth control advocate, the socialist writer Eden Paul, differed with Wells and declared that society must protect itself from, quote, "begetters of antisocial stocks, which would endure generations to come. If society, reject the lethal chamber, what other alternative can the socialist state devise?" If we reject the lethal chamber, what other alternative can the socialist state, that is the dream state of these Fabian idiots, okay, they think they're going to have, well, one of them says it's going to be beyond and we won't need any more lethal chambers, there won't be, almost like, crossing the River Jordan, there'll be no more pain, no more death, no more separation. No, it'll be just like heaven on earth for those few people that they let live. That's where we're at. We are living out H.G. Wells' dream. And they are pretty damn good at it. The British eugenicist Robert Rentul's 1906 book, Race, Culture, or Race Suicide, included a long section entitled The Murder of Degenerates. In it, he routinely referred to Dr. E.F. Smith's earlier suggestion that those found guilty of homicide be executed in a lethal chamber rather than by hanging. He then cited a new novel whose character advocated the doctrine of euthanasia for those suffering from incurable physical diseases. Rentoul admitted he had received many letters in support of killing the unfit, but he rejected them as too cruel, explaining, "These suggestions seem to fail to recognize that the killing off of a few hundreds of lunatics, idiots, etc. would not tend to effect a cure." The debate raged among British eugenicists, provoking damnation in the press. In 1910, the eugenic extremist George Bernard Shaw, you ever heard him referred to before as a eugenic extremist? Yeah. Lectured at London's Eugenics Education Society about mass murder in lethal chambers. Shaw proclaimed, "A part of eugenic politics would finally land us in an extensive use of the lethal chamber. A great many people would have to be put out of existence simply because it wastes other people's time to look after them." Several British newspapers excoriated Shaw and eugenics under such headlines as "Lethal Chamber Essential to Eugenics." One opponent of eugenics condemned much wild and absurd talk about lethal chambers, but in another article, a eugenicist writing under the pseudonym of Van Nock argued that eugenics was needed precisely because systematic use of lethal chambers was unlikely. Quote, "I admit the word eugenics is repellent, but the thing is essential to our existence. It is also an error to believe that the plans and specifications for county council lethal chambers have yet been prepared." The Eugenics Education Society in London tried to dispel all dark mutterings regarding lethal chambers. And its key activist, Saleeby, insisted, quote, "We need mention only to condemn suggestions for painless execution, lethal chambers of carbonic acid, and so forth. As I incessantly have to repeat, eugenics has nothing to do with killing." Saleeby returned to this time and again when lecturing in Battle Creek, Michigan, at the First National Conference on Race Betterment in 1914. He emphasized a vigorous rejection of the lethal chamber, the permission of infant mortality, interference with prenatal life, and all other synonyms for murder. But many British eugenicists clung to the idea. Arthur Treadgold was a leading expert on mental deficiency and one of the earliest members of the Eugenics Education Society. His academic credentials eventually won him a seat on the Brock Commission on Mental Deficiency. Treadgold's landmark textbook on mental deficiency, first published in 1908, completely avoided discussion of the lethal chamber. But 3 subsequent editions published over the next 14 years did discuss it, with each revision displaying greater acceptance of the idea. In those editions, Treadgold equivocated. Quote, "We may dismiss the suggestion of a lethal chamber. I do not say that society in self-defense would be unjustified in adopting such a method of ridding itself of its antisocial constituents. There is much to be said for and against the proposal." By the 6th edition, Treadgold had modified the paragraph to read, "The suggestion of the lethal chamber is a logical one. It is probable that the community will eventually, in self-defense, have to consider this question seriously." The next 2 editions edged into outright, if limited, endorsement. While qualifying that morons need not be put to death, Treadgold concluded that for some 80,000 imbeciles and idiots in Britain, it would be an economical and humane procedure were their existence to be painlessly terminated. The time has come when euthanasia should be permitted. Unquote. Leaders of the American eugenic establishment also debated lethal chambers and other means of euthanasia, but in America, while the debate began as the argument about death with dignity for the terminally ill or those in excruciating pain, it soon became a palatable eugenic solution. In 1900, the physician W. Duncan McKim published Heredity and Human Progress, asserting, "Heredity is the fundamental cause of human wretchedness, the surest, the simplest, the kindest, and the most humane means for preventing reproduction among those whom we deem unworthy of this high privilege, that is, reproduction, is a gentle, painless death." He added, "In carbonic acid gas we have an agent which would instantaneously fulfill the need." Unquote. By 1903, a committee of the National Conferences on Charities and Correction conceded that it was as yet undecided whether science may conquer sentiment, and ultimately elect to systematically kill the unfit. In 1904, the superintendent of New Jersey's Vineland Training School, E.R. Johnstone, raised the issue during his presidential address to the Association of Medical Officers of American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons. That would be a piece of letterhead to see, wouldn't it? Many plans for the elimination of the feeble-minded have been proposed, he said, referring to numerous recently published suggestions of a, quote, painless death. That same year, the notion of executing habitual criminals and the incurably insane was offered to the National Prison Association. Some U.S. lawmakers considered similar ideas. 2 years later, the Ohio legislature considered a bill empowering physicians to chloroform permanently diseased and mentally incapacitated persons. In reporting this, Rentoul told his British colleagues that it was Ohio's attempt to, quote, murder certain persons suffering from incurable disease. Iowa considered a similar measure. By 1910, the idea of sending the unfit into lethal chambers was regularly bandied about in American sociological and eugenic circles, causing a debate no less strident than the one in England. In 1911, E.B. Sherlock's book, The Feeble-Minded, A Guide to Study and Practice, acknowledged that glib suggestions of the erection of lethal chambers are common enough. Like others, he rejected execution in favor of eugenic termination of bloodlines. Apart from the difficulty that the provision of lethal chambers is impracticable in the existing state law, he continued, the removal of them, the feeble-minded, would do practically nothing towards solving the chief problem with the mentally defective set, the persistence of the obnoxious stock. But other eugenicists were more amenable to the idea. The psychologist and eugenicist Henry H. Goddard seemed to almost express regret that such proposals had not already been implemented. In his famous study, The Kallikak Family, Goddard commented, "For the low-grade idiot, the loathsome unfortunate that may be seen in our institutions, some have proposed the lethal chamber. But humanity is steadily tending away from the possibility of that method, and there is no probability that it will ever be practiced." Goddard pointed to family-wide castration, sterilization, and segregation as better solutions because they would address the genetic source. By 1912, Laughlin and others at the eugenics section of the American Breeders' Association considered euthanasia as the eighth of 9 options. Their final report, published by the Carnegie Institution as a 2-volume bulletin, enumerated the suggested remedies and equivocated on euthanasia. Point 8 cited the example of ancient Sparta, fabled for drowning its weak young boys in a river or letting them die of exposure to ensure a race of warriors. Mixing condemnation with admiration, the Carnegie report declared, "However much we deprecate Spartan ideals and her means of advancing them, we must admire her courage in so rigorously applying so practical a system of selection. Sparta left but little besides tales of personal valor to enhance the world's culture. With euthanasia, as in the case of polygamy, an effective eugenical agency would be purchased at altogether too dear a moral price." William Robinson, a New York urologist, published widely on the topic of birth control and eugenics. In Robinson's book, Eugenics, Marriage, and Birth Control, he advocated gassing the children of the unfit. In plain words, Robinson insisted, quote, "The best thing would be to gently chloroform these children or give them a dose of potassium cyanide," unquote. Margaret Sanger was well aware that her fellow birth control advocates were promoting lethal chambers, but she herself rejected the idea completely. "Nor do we believe," wrote Sanger in Pivot of Civilization, "that the community could or should send to the lethal chamber the defective progeny resulting from irresponsible and unintelligent breeding." Still, American eugenicists never relinquished the notion that America could bring itself to mass murder. At the first National Conference on Race Betterment, University of Wisconsin eugenicist Leon J. Cole lectured on the dysgenic effects of charity and medicine on eugenic progress. He made a clear distinction between Darwin's concept of natural selection and the newer idea of simple, quote, selection. The difference, Cole explained, is that instead of being natural selection, it is now conscious selection on the part of the breeder. Death is the normal process of elimination in the social organism, and we might carry the figure a step further and say that in prolonging the lives of defectives, we are tampering with the functioning of the social kidneys. Paul Popenoe, leader of California's eugenics movement and co-author of the widely used textbook Applied Eugenics, agreed that the easiest way to counteract feeble-mindedness was simple execution. Quote, "From a historical point of view," he wrote, "the first method which presents itself is execution. Its value in keeping up the standard of the race should not be underestimated." Madison Grant, who functioned as president of the Eugenics Research Association and the American Eugenics Society, made the point clear in The Passing of the Great Race. Mistaken regard for what are believed to be divine laws and a sentimental belief in the sanctity of human life tend to prevent both the elimination of defective infants and the sterilization of such adults as are themselves of no value to the community. The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race." Unquote. Well, I don't see it, but I wanted to just give you a bit of resonance in another book where Kennan, the the guy from Schiff, from Kuhn Loeb, that ends up in the halls of the State Department writing policy, George F. Kennan, he is the one that wrote this statement that I've quoted many times, and it's in the preface to William Engdahl's book Seeds of Destruction. And from memory, what he said was that because we only are 6% of the world's population, but we have 50% of the wealth, in order for us to sustain our position, we must not be sentimental about going about controlling the rest of the world. And that idea of not being sentimental, it comes up often in various contexts that I think all give us a sense of who these people are, that they could think that way, that we have a duty to mankind to advance the master race, and we can't let our human emotions interfere with our duty to the race itself, or more specifically to the Anglo-Saxon race in most of the cases that we've been studying here at McDuff Channel. All right, I have to make a confession here before we go on. I had a memory from maybe when I was maybe 13, 14 years old of drinking a root beer float made with orange sherbet. Now, I know you expect me to be drinking my usual ginger beer, and that's a reasonable thing to expect me to do, but tonight I just went crazy because they had root beer on sale down at the store for 99 cents. So I got some orange sherbet and some root beer, and I made myself a root beer float. And my wife said she thought, "Ooh, that's going to taste awful," but I must tell you, I was right. These things are great. I highly recommend. Oh yeah. Wow. Woohoo. Well, that's a thrill. I wonder if I'm still resonating from that experience in my teens when I first had my first root beer orange sherbet float. Mm-mm-mm. Right. Okay. Well, back to back to the darkest history of mankind. Is what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? I swear. On November 12, 1915, the issue of eugenic euthanasia sprang out of the shadows and into the national headlines. It began as an unrelated medical decision on Chicago's near North Side. At 4 a.m. that day, a woman named Anna Bollinger gave birth at a German-American hospital. The baby was somewhat deformed and suffered from extreme intestinal and rectal abnormalities, as well as other complications. The delivering physicians awakened Dr. Harry Haselden, the hospital's chief of staff. Haselden, that's Haisselden, came in at once. He consulted with colleagues. There was great disagreement over whether the child could be saved, but Haselden decided the baby was too afflicted and fundamentally not worth saving. It would be killed. The method: denial of treatment. Catherine Walsh, probably a friend of Anna Bollinger's, heard the news and sped to the hospital to help. She found the baby, who had been named Alan, alone in a bare room. He was naked and appeared to have been lying in one position unattended. Walsh urgently called for Haselden to beg that the child be taken to its mother, and dramatically recalled, "It was condemned to death, and I knew its mother would be its most merciful judge." Walsh pleaded with Haselden not to kill the baby by withholding treatment. It was not a monster, that child. Walsh later told an inquest, "It was a beautiful baby. I saw no deformities." Walsh had patted the infant lightly. Alan's eyes were open, and he waved his tiny fists at her. She kissed his forehead. "I knew," she recalled, "if its mother got her eyes on it, she would love it and never permit it to be left to die." Begging the doctor once more, Walsh tried an appeal to his humanity. "If the poor little darling has one chance in 1,000, she pleaded, "won't you operate and save it?" Haselden laughed at Walsh, retorting, "I'm afraid it might get well." He was a skilled and experienced surgeon, trained by the best doctors in Chicago and now chief of the hospital's medical staff. He was also an ardent eugenicist. Chicago's health commissioner, Dr. John Dill Robertson, learned of the deliberate euthanasia. He went to the hospital and told Haselden he did not agree that the child would grow up a mental defective. He later recollected, "I thought the child was in a dying condition, and I had doubts that an operation would save it. Yet I believed it had one chance in 100,000, and I advised Dr. Haselden to give it that one chance, but Haselden refused." Quiet euthanasia of newborns was not uncommon in Chicago. Haselden, however, publicly defended his decision to withhold treatment as a kind of eugenic expedient, throwing the city and the nation into moral turmoil and blaring newspaper headlines. An inquest was convened a few days later. Some of Haselden's most trusted colleagues were impaneled on the coroner's jury. Health Commissioner Robertson testified, "I think it very wrong not to save life. Let that life be what it may. That is the function of a physician. I believe this baby might have grown up to be an average man. I would have operated and saved this baby's life." At one point, Haselden angrily interrupted the health commissioner's testimony to question why he was being singled out when doctors throughout Chicago were routinely killing on average one baby every day under similar circumstances. Haselden defiantly declared, I should have been guilty of a graver crime if I had saved this child's life. My crime would have been keeping in existence one of nature's cruelest blunders. A juror shot back, "What do you mean by that?" Hazelden responded, "Exactly that. I do not think this child would have grown up to be a mental defective. I know it." After tempestuous proceedings, the inquest ruled, "We believe that a prompt operation would have prolonged and perhaps saved the life of this child. We find no evidence from the physical defects that the child would have become mentally or morally defective." The doctor jurors concluded that the child had at least a 1 in 3 chance. Some thought an even chance of surviving, but they also decided that Hazelden was within his professional rights to decline treatment. No law compelled him to operate on the child. The doctor was released unpunished, and efforts by the Illinois Attorney General to indict him for murder were blocked by the local prosecutor. The medical establishment in Chicago and throughout the nation was rocked. The Chicago Tribune ran a giant banner headline across the width of its front page. "Baby dies, physician upheld." One reader in Washington, D.C. wrote a letter to the editor asking, quote, "Is it not strange that the whole country should be so shaken, almost hysterical, over the death of a babe never consciously alive?" But the nation was momentarily transfixed. Hazelden considered his own legal vindication a powerful victory for eugenics. "Eugenics? Of course it's eugenics," he told one reporter. On another occasion he remarked, "Which do you prefer, 6 days of baby Bollinger or 70 years of Jukes?" That's referring to a famous family that was deemed to be unfit in a previous chapter we didn't read. Excuse me a second. Boy, that's good. Emboldened, Hazelden proudly revealed that he had euthanized other such newborns in the past. He began granting high-profile media interviews to advertise his determination to continue passively euthanizing infants. Within 2 weeks, he had ordered his staff to withhold treatment from several more deformed or birth-defected infants. Hazelden would sometimes send instructions via cross-country telegraph while on the lecture tour that arose from his eugenic celebrity. Other times he would handle it personally, like the time he left a newly delivered infant's umbilical cord untied and let it bleed to death. Oh my God. Sometimes he took a more direct approach and simply injected newborns with opiates. The euthanasia of Alan Bollinger may have begun as one doctor's controversial professional decision, but immediately it swirled into a national eugenic spectacle. Days after the inquest ruling, The Independent, a Hearst weekly devoted to pressing issues of the day, ran an editorial asking, "Was the doctor right?" The Independent invited readers to sound off. In a special section, The Independent published supportive letters from prominent eugenicists, including Davenport himself. "If the progress of surgery," wrote Davenport, "is to be used to the detriment of the race, it may conceivably destroy the race. Short-sighted they who would unduly restrict the operation of what is one of nature's greatest racial blessings, death." Hazelden continued to rally for eugenic euthanasia with a 6-week series in the Chicago American. He justified his killings by claiming that public institutions for the feeble-minded, epileptic, and tubercular were functioning as lethal chambers of a sort. After clandestinely visiting the Illinois Institution for the Feeble-Minded at Lincoln, Illinois, Hazelden claimed that windows were deliberately left open and unscreened, allowing drafts and infecting flies to swarm over the patients. He charged that Lincoln consciously permitted flies from the toilets, garbage, and from the eruptions of patients suffering from acute and chronic troubles to go at will over the entire institution. Worse still, he proclaimed, I found that inmates were fed with the milk from a herd of cattle reeking with tuberculosis. At the time, milk from cattle with tuberculosis was a well-known cause of infection and death from the disease. Lincoln maintained its own herd of 72 cows, which produced about 50,000 gallons of milk a year for its own consumption. 10 diseased cows had died within the previous 2 years. State officials admitted that their own examinations had determined that as many as half the cows were tubercular, but there was no way to know which ones were infected, because a tubercular cow may be the fattest cow in the herd. Lincoln officials claimed that their normal pasteurization, quote, by an experienced employee, killed the tuberculosis bacteria. They were silent on the continuous handling of the milk by infected residents. Medical watchdogs had often speculated that institutions for the feeble-minded were really nothing more than slow-acting lethal chambers. But Hazelden never resorted to the term lethal chamber. He called such institutions slaughterhouses. In tuberculosis colonies, residents continuously infected and reinfected each other, often receiving minimal or no treatment. At Lincoln, the recently established tuberculosis unit housed just 40 beds for an estimated tubercular population of hundreds. Lincoln officials asserted that only the most severely infected children were placed in that ward. They stressed that other institutions for the feeble-minded recorded much higher mortality rates, some as high as 40%. Eugenicists believed that when tuberculosis was fatal, the real culprit was not bacteria, but defective genes. The ERO kept special files on mortality rates resulting from hereditary tuberculosis compiled by the Belgian eugenicist Govaerts and others. Tuberculosis was an omnipresent topic in textbooks on eugenics. Typical was a chapter in Davenport's Heredity in Relation to Eugenics, 1911. He claimed that only the submerged tenth was vulnerable. The germs are ubiquitous. Why do only 10% die from the attacks of this parasite? It seemed perfectly plain that death from tuberculosis is the result of infection, added to natural and acquired non-resistance. It is then highly undesirable that 2 persons with weak resistance should marry. Popenoe and Johnston's textbook, Applied Eugenics, devoted a chapter to lethal selection, which operated, quote, through the destruction of the individual by some adverse feature of the environment, such as excessive cold or bacteria, or by bodily deficiency, unquote. Well, I have to stop and just sort of take all that in for a moment. Let's go back to this word slaughterhouses, because I had never really considered the idea that these institutions were actually in the business of killing off their inmates by allowing infectious disease and even something awful as tuberculosis to be present and not to treat it, not to get rid of it. Because that interesting choice of words, he called them slaughterhouses. And this is a famous man of the 19 teens, okay? Would that word slaughterhouses have had any resonance on a writer named Kurt Vonnegut when he was writing about what happened in Dresden in the firebombing? When he named his book Slaughterhouse 5? Was that what was really going on in that building? Was, the use of expendables for medical experimentation, as George Webb has stated? That kind of slaughterhouse? Interesting. And then, now think about the idea of these weaponized viruses that we've been studying. And experiments that are aimed to determine which population has the genes that are resistant to particular diseases. I remember recently reading from Dr. Yamaguchi. He said that they were using HIV blood in Kosovo. That's just the NATO people. Because in that conflict, there are so many different ethnic people, ethnicities grouped together, that they are able to study the effect of HIV on this population in wartime, because it's a very, very diverse population. So that they were looking for people that were resistant, or for people that would instantly succumb to it, then that type of experiment is based on the same thinking that it's a defective person, and that is a eugenic idea, that this person, because their body can't defend against whatever disease they're tested with, that means these are people that should not procreate, they should not be on the earth in the first place, and whether you put him in a lethal chamber or whether you lock him up in a place that's full of tubercular cows, or whatever you do with them, you don't let them procreate and you get them out of the mainstream of your society. That mentality is what we're facing with these people that are always doing the gain of function research for the worse and worse and worse viruses. It's not like they're using it just to make military defense preparations. There's just too many indications that these things have multiple purposes. Whether it's a reduction in a certain population, or used to kill off an enemy in wartime, while having soldiers on your side that you know are protected because they have superior genes, quote unquote. Well, it's always good to have some nice Interesting drops from Michael Lorette. Thank you, Michael. And Pete and everybody else, good to have you with me tonight. Well, let's see how much we can. We're almost done with this chapter. Let me see about. We might make it. Let's try. Some years earlier, the president of the National Conference on Charities and Correction had told his institutional superintendents caring for the feeble-minded, quote, "We wish the parasitic strain to die out." Even an article in Institution Quarterly, Illinois' own journal, admitted it would be an act of kindness to them and a protection to the state if they could be killed. No wonder that at one international conference on eugenics, Davenport proclaimed without explanation from the podium, quote, "One may even view with satisfaction the high death rate in an institution for low-grade feeble-minded, while one regards as a national disaster the loss of the infant child of exceptional parents." Hazelden himself quipped, quote, "Death is the great and lasting disinfectant." Hazelden's accusations of deliberate passive euthanasia by neglect and abuse could neither be verified nor dismissed. Lincoln's understaffed, undercrowded, and decrepit facility consistently reported staggering death rates, often as high as 12% a year. In 1904, for example, 109 of its epileptic children died, constituting at least 10% and probably far more of its youth population. Cause of death was usually listed as exhaustion due to epileptic seizures. Between 1914 and 15, a bout of dysentery claimed 8 patients. Heat exhaustion was listed as the cause. During the same period, 4 individuals died shortly after admission before any preliminary examination at all. Their deaths were categorized as undetermined. For some of the most vulnerable groups, Lincoln's death rate was particularly high. As many as 30% of newly admitted epileptic children died within 18 months of admission. Moreover, in 1915, the overall death rate among patients in their first 2 years of residence jumped from 4.2% to 10%. Tuberculosis was a major factor. In 1915, Lincoln reported that nearly all of its incoming patients were designated feeble-minded, roughly 20% were classified as epileptics, and some 27% of its overall population were, quote, in various stages of tubercular involvement. No isolation was provided for infected patients until the 40-bed tuberculosis unit was opened. Lincoln officials worried that the statistics were likely to leave the impression that the institution is a hotbed for the spread of tuberculosis. Officials denied this, explaining that many of the children came from filthy environments and that, quote, "the fact that feeble-minded children have less resistance accounts for the high percentage of tuberculosis found among them." Lincoln officials clearly accepted the eugenic approach to feeble-mindedness as gospel. Their reports and explanations were laced with scientific quotations on mental deficiency from Treadgold, who advocated euthanasia for severe cases, and Barr, that's B-A-R-R, who extolled the wisdom of the Kansas castrations. Lincoln officials also made clear that they received many of their patients as court-ordered institutionalizations from the Municipal Court of Chicago. As such, they received regular guidance from the court's supervising judge, Harry Olson. Eugenical News praised Olson for operating the court's psychopathic laboratory, which employed Laughlin as a special consultant on sterilization. Olson was vital to the movement and hailed by Eugenical News as one of its most advanced representatives. In 1922, Olson became president of the Eugenics Research Association. Moreover, staff members at Lincoln were some of the leading eugenicists in Illinois. Lincoln psychologist Clara Towne chaired the Eugenics Committee of the Illinois State Commission of Charities and Corrections. Towne had helped compile a series of articles on eugenics and feeble-mindedness, including one by her friend Henry H. Goddard, who had invented the original classifications of feeble-mindedness. One reviewer described Towne's articles as arguments that there was little use in caring for the institutionalized feeble-minded, who would die anyway if left in the community. Caring for them was little more than, quote, unnatural selection. For decades, medical investigators would question how the death rates at asylums, including the one at Lincoln, Illinois, could be so high. In the 1990s, the average life expectancy for individuals with mental retardation was 66.2 years. In the 1930s, the average life expectancy for those classified as feeble-minded was approximately 18.5 years. Records suggest that a disproportionate percentage of the feeble-minded at Lincoln died before the age of 10. Hazelden became an overnight eugenics celebrity, becoming known to the average person because of his many newspaper articles, speaking tours, and his outrageous diatribes. In 1917, Hollywood came calling. The film was called The Black Stork. Written by Chicago American reporter Jack Late, it was produced in Hollywood and given a massive national distribution and promotion campaign. Hazelden played himself in a fictionalized account of a eugenically mismatched couple who are counseled by Hazelden against having children because they are likely to be defective. Eventually, the woman does give birth to a defective child, whom she then allows to die. The dead child levitates into the waiting arms of Jesus Christ. It was unbridled cinematic propaganda for the eugenics movement. In many theaters, such as at the LaSalle in Chicago, the movie played continuously from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. National publicity advertised it as a eugenic love story. Sensational movie posters called it a eugenic photoplay. One advertisement quoted Swiss eugenicist Auguste Forel's warning, quote, "The law of heredity winds like a red thread through the family history of every criminal, of every epileptic, eccentric, and insane person. Shall we sit still without applying the remedy?" Another poster depicted Hazelden's office door with a notice, "Babies not treated." In 1917, a display advertisement for the film encouraged, quote, "Kill defectives, save the nation, and see the Black Stork," unquote. Gassing the unwanted, the lethal chamber, and other methods of euthanasia became a part of everyday American parlance and ethical debates some 2 decades before President Woodrow Wilson, in General Order 62, directed that the, quote, gas service become the, quote, chemical warfare service, unquote, instructing them to develop toxic gas weapons for World War. The lethal chamber was a eugenic concept more than 2 decades before Nevada approved the first such chamber for criminal executions in 1921. And then gassed with cyanide, a Chinese-born murderer, the first such execution in the world. Davenport declared that capital punishment was a eugenic necessity. Popenoe's textbook, Applied Eugenics, listed execution as one of 9 suggested remedies for defectives, without specifying criminals. In The Passing of the Great Race, Madison Grant wrote, "Mistaken regard for what are believed to be divine laws and a sentimental belief in the sanctity of human life tend to prevent both the elimination of defective infants and the sterilization of such adults as are themselves of no value to the community. One day in the early 1930s, AES President Whitney visited the home of Grant, who was at the time chairing a eugenic immigration committee. Whitney wanted to show off a letter he had just received from Germany, written by the corporal, now out of prison and rising in the German political scene. Grant could only smile. He pulled out his own letter. It was from the same German, thanking Grant for writing The Passing of the Great Race. The fan letter stated that Grant's book was, quote, his Bible. The man writing both letters to the American eugenic leaders would soon burn and gas his name into the blackest corner of history. He would duplicate the American eugenic program, both that which was legislated and that which was only brashly advocated. And his group would consistently point to the United States as setting the precedents for Germany's actions. And then this man would go further than any American eugenicist ever dreamed, further than the world would ever tolerate, further than humanity will ever forget. The man who sent those letters was Adolf Hitler. Well, it's a heavy subject, and there we go. It's a direct line from the Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. It is a direct line. And we Americans have got to take hold of this situation. Get these kooks out of the control of our medical system, of our laws, of our economy. We've got everything we need. We just need to take control away from these fanatical eugenicists. All right, well, here's to you guys. Thanks for being with me, and we'll see you tomorrow. 11 a.m., I think we've got George Webb lined up for another Saturday morning McDuffin Webb. So let's look forward to that, 11 a.m. tomorrow morning, and see you then.